Hi everyone, it's Jackie Shulkin, and this is video number 2 in my series about government and civic participation. Today I'll be talking about the Constitution. Basic content. The preamble reads, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." The document is divided into 7 articles. Number 1 deals with the legislative branch. Number 2 deals with the executive branch. Number 3 deals with the judicial branch. These 3 are the bulk of the document. And then number 4 is about the states and the people. 5 is about changing the Constitution. 6 about the supremacy of the Constitution. And 7 is about ratifying the Constitution. So, the father of the Constitution is James Madison. He believed in dispersing power among several branches and establishing constitutional safeguards to prevent any single person or group from controlling the government. He was part of the Federalists who were in favor of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were against it, and later on he joined the Anti-Federalists. He and a few others published a series of essays called the Federalist Papers, in which he argued in favor of the Constitution. So, 2 very important of these documents are Federalist 10 and Federalist 51. Federalist 10 talks about controlling the effects of factions. He believes that a large society under a representative form of government is the best way to do that. He also believes in checking power by balancing factions against each other. Federalist 51 says, "Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." He thinks it's important to protect the minority from a tyrannical majority, and also give the government enough power to govern people, but also to keep its own power in check. Federalism is the division of power between the federal government and the states, which allows the different levels of government to check each other. Specificity. The Constitution does grant specific powers to the President, Congress, states, and the people, and also explicitly denies them some other powers. So there is a system of checks and balances in which we have 3 separate and independent branches so that no one branch can dominate the others. Each one has some specific power to check or limit the others. We see the separation of powers in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. The legislative, or Congress, makes laws. The executive, which is basically the president, enforces the laws. And the judicial, which is the courts, interprets the law. So, legislative versus executive. The president can veto bills, recommend laws, and convene Congress. Congress can override a presidential veto, has the power of the purse, control over budget, can impeach the president, and can also approve presidential treaties and appointments. Judicial versus legislative. The courts have assumed the power of judicial review. This is not specified in the Constitution, but a little bit later I will mention what that is and how it came about. Congress approves judges, sets judicial salaries, and has some power over the structure and jurisdiction of the courts. Executive versus judicial. The president appoints judges and can also issue pardons. So, for instance, in 1974, President Gerald Ford granted a pardon to former President Richard M. Nixon, who had resigned just a month earlier for any crimes he may have committed during the Watergate break-in and cover-up. This was a largely notorious pardon, but it is not uncommon for presidents to issue pardons. Courts, on the other hand, can declare presidential actions unconstitutional. The Constitution also specifies rules for elections so that states and voters do have the power to change the government. The Bill of Rights. This is comprised of the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and it represents the compromise between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists agreed to the Constitution conditional that they would later write up a Bill of Rights. Legislative branch, in other words, Congress. It has two chambers. One is the House of Representatives. In this chamber, the state's population determines how many representatives it will have in the House. Every member represents a district within that state. Each district has roughly the same number of people in it. A census occurs every 10 years, and its purpose is to count all of the people. Seats in the House are reapportioned or reassigned based on new census data. There are 435 seats in the House, and its members are elected every 2 years. The Senate. Senators are elected every 6 years. Only 1/3 of it is elected at a time. We have 2 seats per state, so in total 100. And prior to the 17th Amendment, they were chosen by the state legislatures. However, now they are chosen directly by the people. Among other things that they do, they confirm presidential appointments to federal offices and ratify treaties. Powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerates all of the powers of Congress, so I'm going to go through this with the actual text and point out the most important things in here. So, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. So basically, that's saying Congress has the power to levy taxes. To borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states, and with the Indian tribes. So interstate commerce is regulated by Congress, in other words, by the federal government. To establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States. To coin money, regulate the value thereof, and a foreign coin, and fix a standard of weights and measures. So Congress coins money, and the entire United States has one currency, and it's all the same. This is very important because prior to the Constitution, each state had its own currency, and it was very problematic for trade. So the Constitution changes that. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. To establish post offices and post roads. To promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Tribunals is just a fancy word for courts. To define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Okay? To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. So only Congress can declare war. However, the president, as we will see later on in the series, does have the power to take military action as commander-in-chief, but he or she cannot actually declare war. That is something that Congress has to do. Okay. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. Again, prior to the Constitution, the central government could not ask for any armed forces, so General Washington basically had to beg for forces and supplies during the American Revolution. So again, the Constitution changes that. To provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. The Union is another way of referring to the United States. Suppress insurrections and repel invasions. To provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be, for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So the last little paragraph where we see the words necessary and proper, very important. This is called the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. And what this does is it gives Congress some implied powers. Everything else is what we call enumerated powers, meaning they are specifically spelled out in the Constitution. But this last little clause gives us room for implied powers. And one of the great debates right after the Constitution was ratified was the National Bank. Alexander Hamilton favored the creation of a national bank. He was a Federalist, and the Anti-Federalists opposed that because they said that it was not spelled out in the Constitution. So the Federalists, based on the elastic clause, argued a loose interpretation of the Constitution, while the Anti-Federalists argued a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And in the end, we did wind up having a national bank. Okay, more powers of Congress. Basically, to make laws. In order to do that, a bill is approved by both the House and the Senate. Then it goes to the President, who either signs or vetoes. And after that, Congress can override a veto with 2/3 vote in both houses. Congress also has the so-called power of the purse, which means it can tax citizens and spend money raised by taxes. Also, impeachment. Impeaching is a way to get rid of an elected official. And what happens very basically in an impeachment is that first, the House of Representatives impeaches the president by actually bringing forth the charges, and then the Senate votes either to convict or not to convict. In the entire history of the United States, only 2 presidents have been impeached. First one, Andrew Jackson, and the second one, Bill Clinton. Both were acquitted. Congress also has some prohibited powers, meaning stuff it cannot do. So, an ex post facto law is a law that makes something illegal after it has already been done. Congress cannot do that. A bill of attainder declares a person guilty of a crime. Congress also cannot do that because people have the right to due process and all this stuff. So Congress can't just come out and say that someone is guilty of a crime. Additionally, suspending the writ of habeas corpus except in times of national emergency. Habeas corpus means that when somebody is arrested, they must be charged and they must be told why they are being arrested. So you can't just be arrested for no reason. There has to be a reason behind it, basically. Okay, let's talk about the executive branch. The president conducts foreign policy, commands the armed forces as commander-in-chief, appoints federal judges and other government officials, can veto congressional bills, and grant clemency. In other words, presidential pardons, which I was talking about earlier with the whole Nixon thing. Okay, the vice president presides over the Senate and casts the deciding vote in case of a tie. Also becomes president if the president dies, relinquishes the office, or is otherwise unable to perform duties. This role has evolved over time. In the past, most were excluded from policymaking, but recent ones have been heavily involved in policymaking. For example, Dick Cheney. The judicial branch. So, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the country, and the Chief Justice is the head of that court. Appointment to the bench consists of being appointed by the President and then approved by the Senate. Justices in the Supreme Court can only be forced to leave if impeached and convicted, and they basically hold office for life. Obviously, they could also quit, but as long as they are alive, they hold office. Judicial review means that the Supreme Court can decide that a law is unconstitutional and therefore the law is null and void. This power is not specified in the Constitution. The Supreme Court itself established and assumed this power in a case called Marbury v. Madison in 1803. Changing the Constitution. So, in order to amend the Constitution, an amendment must be proposed by either a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress or by conventions called in 2/3 of the states. Then, it must be ratified by either the approval of 3/4 of the state legislatures or by ratifying conventions held in 3/4 of the states. However, all but one of the 27 amendments have been proposed by Congress and ratified by the state legislatures. There are, however, informal ways of changing the Constitution. For example, Congress has given the President the responsibility of submitting a budget. The President has entered into executive agreements with foreign leaders without prior approval, and the Supreme Court assuming the power of judicial review. So that's all for today's video. If you guys didn't watch my last video, be sure to check that one out, and be sure to stay tuned for the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and see you guys soon. Bye!